Ben had been a long-haul trucker for nearly 12 years. He'd driven through the sun-scorched highways of Nevada, the green fields of Kansas, and the windy, treacherous routes in the Rockies. For Ben, the road was more than just a means to an end. It was freedom, the very thing he'd been craving since he was a boy. But lately, his restless spirit was met with an unexpected yearning for home. Home, for Ben, was in a modest neighborhood just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was where his wife, Emily, waited, or at least, where he thought she was waiting. Emily was his anchor. She'd stood by him through the long hauls, the unpredictable schedules, and the late-night phone calls that filled the emptiness of his drives. For Ben, the thought of her alone was often enough to make him push through the exhausting hours. But over the past few weeks, something had shifted. Emily's messages had grown shorter, her voice distant. "It's just work stress," he told himself. "She's busy, just like me." But the unease lingered. One Thursday, while making a delivery to Birmingham, Ben got a call from his dispatcher. They'd shuffled the schedule. He'd be heading home early. Grinning, he decided not to tell Emily. He'd surprise her. The thought warmed him through the last stretch of his drive. In his mind, he pictured her expression, the shock in her eyes, maybe even the smile that used to light up her face when he returned. As he pulled his truck into the driveway early the next morning, he noticed that the blinds in the bedroom were drawn, and a soft light seeped through the edges. "Up early, huh?" he thought with a grin, imagining her bustling around the kitchen, perhaps making coffee or catching up on her reading. Ben entered quietly, wanting to keep his surprise intact. The house was still. He took a breath, inhaling the faint smell of coffee and something else. A breakfast, half eaten, lay on the counter, a cup of coffee, still warm beside it. "Emily," he called softly, but there was no response. As he made his way down the hall, he noticed the bedroom door was slightly ajar, light spilling into the hallway. A pang of uncertainty hit him, the kind that twists in your gut and makes you wonder if you should turn back. But he kept walking. Pushing the door open, Ben's world shattered in an instant. There, in their bed, lay Emily and another man. In that silent, frozen moment, their eyes locked. The man beside her jerked upright, and Emily gasped, pulling the sheets around her, her face stricken. Ben felt as if the floor had been yanked from beneath him. His chest tightened, heart pounding wildly, as he tried to process the scene in front of him. His brain screamed for him to react, but he found himself incapable of any response. Without a word, Ben turned around and walked out, leaving behind everything he thought was solid and true. He headed back to his truck, the only place that had ever really felt like his own, started the engine, and drove. Anywhere, nowhere, it didn't matter. The last fragments of the life he thought he had slipped away behind him as he hit the open road, letting the night swallow him whole. For hours, Ben drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The hum of the engine was his only companion, filling the empty space around him as he sped down the highway, miles stretching endlessly before him. He didn't have a destination, just the need to get as far away as possible. As the sun began to rise, he pulled off at a deserted rest area, shutting off the engine and letting the silence settle over him. The stillness was heavy, pressing down on him as he sat, slumped over the steering wheel, his mind replaying the scene he'd just left behind. The look in Emily's eyes, that moment of frozen shock, the stranger lying beside her. It was all too much. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over her name in his contacts. He wanted answers, explanations, something to make sense of this nightmare. But instead, he shoved the phone back into his pocket, letting out a long, shaky breath. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his voice thick with anger and disbelief. How could she do this? After everything they'd been through, the late nights, the missed holidays, the times he'd driven through exhaustion just to get back to her a little sooner. All of it now seemed pointless, shattered in an instant. He thought about the years he'd devoted to building their life together, the way he'd scrimped and saved, dreaming of a better future for both of them. But as he sat there, staring into the empty rest stop, those dreams felt like ashes, slipping through his fingers. A couple of hours passed before he finally managed to get some sleep, though it was restless, filled with images of Emily and memories of the life they'd shared. By the time he woke up, the sun was high in the sky, casting an unforgiving light on the reality he now faced. As he got back on the road, his mind was still racing, thoughts tumbling over one another. He couldn't go back, not to her, not to that house, and certainly not to the life he'd once known. But he didn't know where else to go either. The road stretched out before him, offering an escape but no direction. He drove until he reached a small town he'd passed through countless times before but had never really noticed. On the outskirts, he spotted a diner with a parking lot big enough for his truck. He decided to stop, if only to get his bearings and maybe drown his frustration in a cup of coffee. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. He slid into a booth, and a waitress approached, her eyes filled with kindness as she handed him a menu. "Long night?" she asked with a knowing smile. Ben looked up, managing a half-hearted nod. "You could say that." She took his order, and as he sat there, something began to shift within him. He wasn't sure what it was, but in the quiet of that diner, a small part of him felt free. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he wasn't rushing to get somewhere or thinking about the next delivery. He was just there, alone, with his own thoughts. And as strange as it was, it felt like the beginning of something. Something unknown but perhaps worth exploring. As Ben sat alone in the diner, he found himself looking around, taking in the surroundings with fresh eyes. The place had an old-fashioned charm. Red vinyl booths, black and white tiled floors, and the smell of coffee and bacon hanging thick in the air. He couldn't remember the last time he just sat somewhere without watching the clock or thinking about getting back on the road. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting it down in front of him with a gentle smile. "Anything else I can get for you, hon?" Ben looked up, noticing for the first time the faint lines around her eyes, a testament to the years she'd probably spent serving coffee and listening to stories. He hesitated, then asked, Do you know anywhere around here where a guy could find work? Maybe a place that's hiring?" The waitress seemed surprised, but she didn't ask any questions. She just nodded thoughtfully. "Well, folks around here always need a hand, but it depends on what you're looking to do. The auto shop down the street sometimes needs extra help, especially with all the trucks coming through town. You got any experience with that sort of thing?" Ben gave a small, humorless laugh. "More than you'd think. Spent a good chunk of my life behind the wheel." She nodded, giving him an understanding smile. "Well, why don't you swing by? Owner's name is Hank. Real nice guy, if you can get past his bark. Tell him Lorna sent you. He might just give you a shot." Ben thanked her and finished his coffee, the bitterness lingering on his tongue as he considered what he was about to do. He'd never worked anywhere other than behind the wheel of a truck, but maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to start fresh, to find a new purpose, even if he wasn't sure what that was yet. Leaving the diner, he walked down the street, his boots echoing off the quiet pavement. The town had a peaceful, almost forgotten quality to it, like a place time had left behind. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of calm. The auto shop wasn't hard to find. A sign out front read, "Hank's Garage," in faded letters, and a handful of cars were parked outside, waiting for repairs. He stepped inside, taking in the smell of oil and grease, the faint hum of machinery coming from the back. An older man with a grizzled beard and grease-stained hands looked up from under the hood of a pickup, giving Ben a sharp once-over. "Can I help you?" His voice was gruff, but there was a hint of curiosity behind it. Ben cleared his throat. "I'm looking for work. Lorna over at the diner said you might need an extra pair of hands." Hank squinted at him, wiping his hands on a rag. "You know anything about engines?" "Enough to keep my rig on the road," Ben replied, a bit of pride slipping into his voice. "Been driving and fixing trucks for years." Hank considered him for a moment, then nodded toward a beat-up old car in the corner of the garage. "All right, let's see what you've got. That piece of junk's been giving me trouble all morning. Think you can figure it out?" Ben rolled up his sleeves, surprised to feel a spark of excitement. It wasn't much, but it was a challenge, a chance to focus on something real, something he could fix with his own two hands. As he got to work, Hank watched him, occasionally offering a gruff comment or pointing out a tool he might need. The hours slipped by, and for the first time since he'd walked out of his house, Ben felt a hint of peace. By the time he'd finished, the car was purring like new. Hank gave him an approving nod. Not bad. I could use someone who knows his way around an engine. How about you start tomorrow? Ben agreed, feeling a small sense of accomplishment as he walked back out into the sunlight. It wasn't the life he'd known, but maybe that was exactly what he needed. The next day, Ben arrived at the garage early, the morning light casting long shadows over the small town. He hadn't slept well. Thoughts of Emily and everything he'd left behind still haunted him. But for the first time in a while, he had somewhere to be, something to do that didn't involve the empty miles of the highway. Hank greeted him with a gruff nod, already elbow-deep in an engine. "Glad to see you're on time," he said without looking up. "Most folks don't last long around here." Ben nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Well, I'm not most folks." Hank smirked, his eyes flicking over to Ben for a moment. "We'll see about that." The hours passed quickly as Ben threw himself into the work, losing himself in the rhythm of fixing engines and tightening bolts. There was something therapeutic about it, something grounding. Every now and then, Hank would pass by, giving him a bit of advice or showing him a new trick. Slowly, Ben realized that this gruff old mechanic was warming up to him. By lunchtime, Ben was wiping his hands on a rag when he noticed a few townspeople gathered outside the shop, chatting and laughing as they waited for their cars. One of them, a middle-aged man with a friendly face, waved him over. "You must be the new guy Hank hired," he said, smiling as he extended a hand. "Name's Carl. You just moved to town?" "Something like that," Ben replied, shaking his hand. "Well, welcome. It's good to see a new face around here. Hank doesn't hire just anyone, you know?" Ben chuckled, a bit of pride swelling in his chest. "Guess I got lucky." Over the next few weeks, Ben started to settle into a new rhythm. The pain of what he'd left behind hadn't disappeared, but it dulled with each passing day. He got to know the regulars who came by the shop and even found himself laughing at their jokes, sharing stories about the road, and feeling, for the first time in years, like he was part of something. One afternoon, after closing up the shop, he was about to head back to his small apartment when Hank called out, "Hey Ben, we're having a little get-together at the bar down the street tonight. You should come by." Ben hesitated. The idea of socializing, of letting his guard down, still felt foreign. But Hank's invitation sounded more like a challenge, and he wasn't one to back down from that. "Sure," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "I'll be there." Later that evening, Ben walked into the dimly lit bar, where Hank and a few of the townspeople were already gathered. Laughter and the clink of glasses filled the room, the warmth of the place washing over him. He took a seat at the bar, nodding to Hank, who was nursing a beer. As the night wore on, Ben found himself relaxing, laughing, and sharing stories he hadn't told in years. The townspeople welcomed him like one of their own, and for the first time since he'd left Charlotte, he felt a hint of something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Toward the end of the night, he found himself in conversation with a woman named Claire. She had a calm, steady presence and a quiet sense of humor that put him at ease. She'd lived in the town her whole life, running a small bookstore down the road. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing naturally as if they'd known each other for years. As he walked back to his apartment that night, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he'd found something in this town that he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. The pain of his past was still there, but now there was something else too, a sense of hope. Over the next few months, Ben's life took on a new rhythm. Working with Hank became second nature, and as he got to know the townspeople, he found himself feeling more at home in the small town than he ever had back in Charlotte. He had friends now, people who cared about him, who saw him for who he was, not just the work he did. He also found himself drawn to Claire. She'd stop by the garage occasionally, bringing him lunch or just saying hello. Their conversations grew longer each time, and soon he was spending his evenings at her bookstore, helping her close up and talking about everything from their favorite books to the dreams they'd both once had but had set aside. Her warmth and steady presence felt like a balm, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Ben felt his heart starting to heal. One evening, after closing up the shop, Ben and Claire took a walk along the quiet streets of the town. The night was cool, and the stars shone brightly above them. As they walked, Ben finally found the courage to tell her about his past, about Emily, and the pain he'd carried with him. "I thought I had everything figured out," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought I knew what my life was supposed to be. But then, it all just fell apart. I didn't know who I was without it." Claire listened quietly, her hand slipping into his as he spoke. When he finished, she looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Sometimes, we have to lose everything to find out who we really are," she said gently. "And maybe this is where you were meant to be all along." Her words settled over him like a weight lifting from his shoulders. For so long, he'd been haunted by the life he'd left behind, by the sense that he'd failed. But standing there, under the vast night sky with Claire by his side, he realized that he wasn't defined by what had happened to him. He had the chance to start over, to build something new. In the months that followed, Ben fully embraced his life in the town. He became a familiar face at Hank's garage, a place where people knew they could rely on him, where he was part of something. He and Claire grew closer, their friendship blossoming into a love built on understanding and trust. Looking back, Ben no longer felt bitterness toward Emily. She had made her choice, and he'd found a life that was richer and more meaningful than he'd ever thought possible. He'd found a new purpose, a place where he belonged, and someone who loved him for who he was. For the first time in a long time, Ben felt a deep, abiding peace. He'd learned that life had a way of breaking you down only to build you up stronger than before. And as he stood outside the garage one evening, watching the sun set over the town he'd come to call home, he knew he'd finally found the freedom he'd been searching for. Not on the open road, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life rebuilt from the ground up. Ben's journey had taken him far, but it had ultimately led him back to himself, stronger and wiser, with a heart that had healed. And though the road would always be a part of him, he was no longer running. He was home. A year had passed since Ben's life had shifted so profoundly, and he could barely recognize the man he'd once been. The rhythm of his days was steady, filled with work at the garage, conversations with friends, and quiet evenings with Claire. Yet, sometimes he found himself pausing, wondering about the unexpected path he'd taken to arrive here and how much he'd learned along the way. One evening, as he and Claire were having dinner at her small apartment above the bookstore, she handed him an old, weathered notebook. "What's this?" he asked, flipping through the blank pages. "Consider it a fresh start," she replied with a smile. "I know you've got stories, Ben. The road, the things you've seen, everything that's brought you here. Maybe it's time to write it down." At first, Ben shrugged it off, uncertain. He'd never considered himself the type to put pen to paper. But that night, as he sat alone with the notebook, he felt the weight of everything he'd carried over the years: the open highways, the sleepless nights, the heartbreak, and the new beginnings. It all felt like a story that needed to be told. And so, he began to write. He wrote about the freedom he'd felt on the road, the way the landscape changed with every mile, and the solitude that had once felt like a friend. He wrote about Emily, the life they'd shared, and how he'd had to let her go. And he wrote about the small town that had given him a second chance, the people who'd welcomed him, and the love he'd found when he'd least expected it. The act of writing brought him a sense of clarity he hadn't anticipated. Each page felt like a step forward, a release of the past and an embrace of the present. Over time, he filled the notebook, not just with his memories, but with the lessons he'd learned: resilience, forgiveness, and the strength that comes from allowing oneself to start over. One evening, after closing the garage, he handed the notebook to Claire. "I don't know if it's any good," he said, feeling uncharacteristically nervous, "but I wanted you to read it." Claire took it from him, her eyes warm and encouraging. "I'm sure it's more than good, Ben. It's you." In the days that followed, Claire read his story, page by page, and each night, they talked about the memories he'd shared. She saw pieces of him he hadn't shown before, glimpses into his heart and mind that even he hadn't fully understood. And as she turned the last page, she looked up at him with a smile that held a quiet pride. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.